always thought love was supposed to be simple. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. When I met Daniel, I was convinced he was the one. He was charming, kind, and most importantly, he understood me in ways no one else ever had. For 3 years, we built something together, memories, plans, a future. Marriage seemed like the natural next step. My family adored him, and my father, especially, took a deep liking to him. The two of them got along so well that sometimes I even felt a little left out. It's a rare thing, my mother had told me once. A man who respects his future father-in-law like that? You're lucky, sweetheart. I believed her. Maybe I was lucky. But then things started to shift. First it was subtle. Daniel stopped holding my hand as often, stopped kissing me when he thought no one was looking. I brushed it off, assuming he was just stressed. Work had been keeping him busy after all. Then, he started avoiding our private dates. Dinners that used to stretch late into the night became short and forced. His texts were still sweet, but something about them felt distant. Yet despite this, he was at my house more than ever. Not to see me, to see my father. Daniel was here again today, my mother mentioned one evening as we cleared the dishes. I swear, your father might as well adopt him. I forced a laugh. Yeah, they really get along. It should have made me happy. My dad had always been strict when it came to the men I dated. But Daniel? He welcomed him with open arms like a son he never had. They talked for hours about everything: sports, politics, even business. I told myself it was a good thing. Then came the nights when Daniel would come over and spend more time in my father's study than with me. I would knock on the door only to hear, "We're in the middle of something, sweetheart. Give us a minute." A minute turned into an hour. An hour turned into the whole evening. I tried not to think too much of it. But the distance between us kept growing. And doubt started creeping into my mind. One night, as we lay in bed, I turned to him. "Daniel, is everything okay?" He hesitated, then smiled too quickly. "Of course, why wouldn't it be?" "I don't know. You don't seem like yourself lately." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I'm fine. Just a little overwhelmed with everything. Work. The wedding. It's a lot." I wanted to believe him. So I did. Until the night that shattered everything. It was late when I got home, later than usual. I had been out with some friends, trying to shake off the unease that had been building inside me. The house was quiet, the lights dimmed. My mother had gone to bed, but I could hear the faint sound of movement coming from the kitchen. I stepped inside, and there they were. Daniel, my father, kissing. My breath caught in my throat, a strangled noise escaping before I could stop it. They pulled apart instantly, eyes wide, faces pale. A silence heavier than anything I'd ever known filled the space between us. And then Daniel whispered my name, but I was already turning away. I don't remember running up the stairs, but I must have, because suddenly I was in my bedroom, the door slamming shut behind me. My hands were shaking. My breathing was shallow, ragged. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the image was burned into my mind. Daniel's hands on my father's face, their lips pressed together. The look in their eyes when they saw me standing there. My stomach twisted violently. I ran to the bathroom, barely making it before I retched into the toilet. My body trembled as I clutched the cold porcelain, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. There was a knock at my door. Soft, hesitant. "Emily." It was Daniel's voice. "Please, can we talk?" Talk? What was there to talk about? I wiped my mouth, stood up, and stormed to the door. My hand hovered over the handle, shaking with fury. "Go away." I spat through gritted teeth. "Emily, please." His voice cracked. "Just let me explain." I let out a bitter laugh, pressing my forehead against the wood. "Explain what, Daniel? That you've been lying to me this whole time? That you've been sneaking around with my father?" A sharp exhale from the other side. "It's not like that." I yanked the door open. He stood there, looking pale and desperate. "Then what is it like?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Tell me, Daniel. Make it make sense." He opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands clenched into fists. "I never wanted to hurt you." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, well, that makes it better. I love you, Emily." His voice was almost pleading. "Ido." I shook my head.
No.
No, you don't. You don't do this to someone you love. He reached for my hand, but I yanked it away. The touch of him made my skin crawl. Just tell me the truth, I whispered. How long? He hesitated. And that told me everything. I sucked in a sharp breath. How long, Daniel? He looked down, guilt washing over his face. Almost a year. I staggered back as if he had struck me. A year. A whole year. I had spent the last year planning a future with him, imagining our wedding, our home, our life together. And the entire time he had been. Oh my God, I breathed. You've been using me. His eyes snapped up.
No.
No, Emily. Isso é. You got close to me to get to him, didn't you? My voice was shaking. Did you ever love me at all? I did, he said, stepping closer. I do. I let out a choked sob. Stop lying to me. His shoulders slumped. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I laughed, the sound broken and hollow. So what was supposed to happen, Daniel? Were you just going to keep pretending until the wedding? Until after? Were you ever going to tell me? His silence was my answer. I shook my head, wrapping my arms around myself as nausea churned in my stomach. I felt sick, betrayed, humiliated. And then another voice broke the silence. Emily. I turned. My father stood at the end of the hallway, his face filled with something I couldn't even begin to name. Guilt, regret, shame. Something in me snapped. You, I whispered, my hands curling into fists. You're just as bad. He took a hesitant step forward. I never meant to hurt you, sweetheart. Don't. I held up a hand, stepping back. You don't get to call me that. Pain flickered across his face. I love you, Emily. You're my daughter. Nothing changes that. I let out a breathless, bitter laugh. Everything changes that. He looked away, swallowing hard. I know this is a lot, but please let me explain. I shook my head, the tears finally spilling down my cheeks. There's nothing you can say that will make this okay. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Daniel took a step forward. Emily, Get out, I whispered. Neither of them moved. I looked at my father, my vision blurred with tears. Both of you. Get out. Daniel opened his mouth, but I cut him off with a sharp glare. I swear to God, if you don't leave right now. He flinched, then nodded slowly. Okay. My father hesitated. His eyes filled with something almost like sorrow, but I didn't care. Not anymore. I slammed the door in their faces, and then I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing until my body ached. I don't know how long I stayed on the floor, curled up in a shaking mess of sobs. Minutes. Hours. Time didn't seem to function properly anymore. My world had shattered in an instant, and I had no idea how to piece it back together. At some point, my mother knocked on my door, her voice gentle. Emily, sweetheart. What's wrong? I couldn't answer. I couldn't tell her. How could I? How could I even begin to explain what had just happened? So I stayed silent, biting down on my lips so hard I tasted blood. After a while she sighed. I don't know what's going on, but I'm here. Okay. Whatever it is, I'm here. Her footsteps faded down the hall, leaving me alone once more. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything over and over again. The way Daniel had looked at me. The way my father had looked at him. The way I had been so completely, utterly blind. A year. They had been lying to me for a year. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something, throw something, anything to make the pain feel less suffocating. But all I could do was curl deeper into myself, shaking with silent sobs. At some point, exhaustion took over, pulling me into a restless sleep filled with fragmented nightmares. When I woke up the next morning, my body felt heavy, my mind sluggish. For a brief, blissful second, I forgot everything, and then it all came rushing back. The betrayal, the lies, the image of them kissing. A sharp knock at my door made me jolt upright, my heart pounding. Emily. My mother's voice came through again, firmer this time. Come downstairs. Now. Something in her tone sent a shiver through me. I forced myself out of bed, my body protesting every movement. My legs felt weak as I made my way down the stairs, dread coiling in my stomach. And then I saw them. Daniel and my father. Sitting in the living room. waiting for me. My breath hitched. I turned to my mother, my eyes wide with panic. Why are they? She held up a hand. Sit. I hesitated, glancing between her and them. My father looked pale, his hands clasped together. Daniel looked miserable, his eyes fixed on the floor. I swallowed hard and sat on the farthest couch, crossing my arms tightly over my chest. I don't want to do this. I don't care, my mother said, her voice sharp. Something is going on, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it. She turned to my father, her eyes narrowing. Start talking. My father exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands over his face. I never meant for this to happen. I let out a bitter laugh. That's what he said too. I shot Daniel a glare, and he flinched. My mother stiffened. What exactly happened? Silence. I saw the moment it clicked in her head. The way her face paled, her breath hitched. Oh my God. I clenched my jaw, looking away. My mother stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. Please tell me I'm wrong. My father looked up at her, his expression filled with something that almost looked like pleading. But he didn't say a word. And that was enough. My mother sucked in a sharp breath, taking a step back. How long? I laughed, a cold, hollow sound. A year. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. My father stood up. Karen. Don't, she snapped. Don't say my name like that. She turned to Daniel, her eyes blazing. And you were going to marry my daughter. Daniel flinched. I know. I never wanted to hurt her. Bullshit, she spat. You knew exactly what you were doing. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I watched as my mother clenched her fists, her whole body trembling. I trusted you, she whispered, voice thick with emotion. I trusted both of you. My father swallowed hard. Karen, I love you. Shut up, she hissed. You don't get to say that to me. The air in the room was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. And then my mother turned to me, her face softening. Emily, I'm so sorry. Tears burned at the back of my eyes. Me too. She nodded once, then turned back to my father and Daniel. Both of you, get out. Daniel's head snapped up. Karen, please. Now. There was something final in her voice. Something that made both of them hesitate. But they didn't argue. My father reached for her, but she stepped back, her eyes flashing with pain. He nodded stiffly, swallowing hard, then turned to leave. Daniel lingered, his eyes locking onto mine. Emily. I turned away. And then they were gone. The door slammed shut behind them. And for the first time in hours I finally breathed. The silence after they left was unbearable. It stretched through the house like an open wound, raw and aching. My mother stood frozen, staring at the door as if she expected them to come back. I watched her, waiting for her to say something, to yell, to cry, to break down the way I had. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, let out a slow, measured breath, and turned to me. Come on, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Let's sit. I hesitated, but then followed her back to the couch. My body felt too heavy, my limbs sluggish as I sank into the cushions. For a long time neither of us spoke. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on us, suffocating. Finally, my mother broke the silence. How did you find out? I swallowed hard, my fingers curling against my knees. Last night. I came home late and found them in the kitchen. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to continue. They were kissing. My mother closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling sharply. When she opened them again, there was no shock left, just quiet devastation. I should have known, she murmured. I looked up at her, my brows furrowing. What do you mean? She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. Your father has been different. Distant. I thought it was just work stress. Or maybe he was nervous about the wedding. But looking back, the signs were there. I stared at her, my stomach twisting. She had noticed something was wrong too. And yet, neither of us had seen the truth until it was too late. I clenched my jaw. How could he do this to us? My mother sighed, rubbing her temple. Because he's selfish. The bitterness in her voice startled me. I had never heard her sound so cold. People like him, she continued. They don't think about the damage they leave behind. They just take what they want. I looked away, blinking back the sting in my eyes. I loved him, I whispered. I really thought we were going to be happy. She reached for my hand, squeezing gently. I know. I let out a shaky breath, my grip tightening around hers. For the first time since everything fell apart, I didn't feel entirely alone. The next few days passed in a blur. My father tried to call. I didn't answer. Daniel texted. I deleted every message. I wanted to erase them both from my life, but the betrayal clung to me like a second skin, refusing to be ignored. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Every time I tried to sleep, I heard Daniel's voice, pleading, apologizing, lying. I hated him, but I hated my father more. And then, on the third night, I found myself standing outside his office door. I didn't even remember deciding to come here. My feet had carried me before my brain could catch up, my anger too heavy to hold in any longer. Taking a deep breath, I raised my fist and knocked. A few seconds later, the door swung open. My father froze when he saw me. His face was drawn, exhaustion lining his features. Emily. I pushed past him, stepping inside. His office smelled the same: leather, old books, faint traces of his cologne. The familiarity made me sick. I turned to face him, crossing my arms. Why? He shut the door quietly, exhaling. I don't expect you to understand. Then make me, I snapped. Because right now, I don't understand anything. He ran a hand through his graying hair, looking down. I didn't plan this. I laughed bitterly. Right. You just accidentally fell in love with my fiancé. He flinched. I know it sounds terrible. It is terrible, I hissed. It's disgusting. It's cruel. You betrayed me. Dad. My voice broke on the last word. You destroyed everything. He looked at me then, his expression filled with something I couldn't name. I never wanted to hurt you. I shook my head, tears burning in my eyes. But you did. Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking. Did you ever love Mom? His face fell. Of course I did. Then how could you do this to her? My voice was barely a whisper. He sighed, rubbing his face. I don't have a good answer, Emily. I wish I did. I let out a slow, shaky breath. Are you in love with him? His jaw tightened, and he hesitated just for a second. But it was enough. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You are. I never meant for this to happen, he repeated. Softer this time. I clenched my fists. Stop saying that. It doesn't mean anything. He looked away. I know. I turned, heading for the door. I couldn't do this. I couldn't listen to him try to justify something so unforgivable. Emily, he called, his voice filled with desperation. Please. I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I don't know who you are anymore, I whispered. And then I walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't go home right away. After leaving my father's office, I drove aimlessly through the city. My mind a whirlwind of emotions: anger, grief, betrayal. I kept gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my knuckles white, as if I could hold myself together through sheer force of will. But I was breaking. I pulled into an empty parking lot and turned off the engine. The silence in the car was deafening. I stared out at the dark street, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to wake up and realize this was all some twisted nightmare. But it wasn't. I had lost my fiancé. I had lost my father. And I had no idea how to move forward. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Daniel. I grabbed the phone and for a moment, I considered answering. I imagined his voice on the other end, his pathetic apologies, his desperate attempts to make me understand. Instead, I turned off my phone and threw it onto the floor. Let him suffer in silence. When I finally walked into the house, my mother was waiting for me in the kitchen. She looked up from her untouched cup of tea, her eyes filled with quiet concern. You okay? I let out a hollow laugh as I sank into the chair across from her. Not even close. She nodded, as if she expected that answer. Did you see him? I swallowed. Yeah. She sighed, rubbing her temple. And, I shook my head. It doesn't change anything. She studied me for a long moment, then reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you're going to be okay. I stared at our hands, my throat tightening. How? She squeezed gently. Because you're stronger than you think. I wanted to believe her. I really did. Days turned into weeks. I didn't hear from my father again. At first I expected him to keep calling, to keep trying. But he didn't. And somehow, that hurt more than anything. Daniel, on the other hand, wasn't as easy to ignore. I ran into him once at the grocery store. He looked awful, tired, unshaven. His usual confidence replaced with something almost like regret. Emily, he started, his voice hesitant. I turned and walked the other way. Let him feel what it was like to be abandoned. One night, my mother knocked on my bedroom door. Come in, I mumbled, sitting up in bed. She stepped inside, hesitating for a moment before sitting next to me. She held something in her hands, a small, silver-framed photograph. She handed it to me without a word. I looked down. It was an old picture, one I hadn't seen in years. Me as a little girl, sitting on my father's shoulders, laughing as he held onto my legs. I traced the edges of the frame with my fingers, my heart aching. I don't know what happens next, my mother said softly. But I do know that you don't have to figure it out alone. I closed my eyes, exhaling shakily. The pain wasn't gone. The betrayal still lingered. But maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to survive it.